watching Talking Point on Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. It's a pleasure to reintroduce Salvador Babones. He's an adjunct scholar at the Center for Independent Studies, CISOS, in Sydney, as well as an associate professor and the author of The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts. Dr. Babones, thank you so much. And I'm sorry for having you to burn the midnight oil there in Sydney just to get on the show.
Oh, this is how I love to spend my Friday nights. Remember, I'm a middle-aged political commentator, not a 20-something out at the clubs. It's great to be with you.
Well, that's certainly not the case with Anand Krishnan, the China correspondent of The Hindu and the author of a new book called India's China Challenge. He joins us from Chennai. Anand, thanks for your time as well.
My pleasure, absolutely. Thank you, Amitabh.
Dr. Babones, just looking at your latest writings where you talk about it's time for Western universities to cut China ties. And your argument is because in their greed for money or the allure for moolah, for funding, universities have become China's Trojan horse, or your piece puts it as the fifth column in the West. Can you elaborate that thought for us?
Well, for the last 30 years, we have been engaging with China on the theory that by engaging with China, we'll be pulling China up, we'll be raising standards in China, we'll be spreading a more liberal approach to the universities and the world as a whole in China. And I think for maybe 25 years that was working. I mean, up until 2015 or so, up until Xi Jinping took power in 2014, all right, China wasn't perfect. There were serious problems in China, but you could make the argument up until at least 5 years ago that China was getting better. There were problems, but it was improving. The last 5 years, and especially the last 2 years, we have seen things go entirely a different direction. And China is clearly not liberalizing. China has been proudly illiberalizing, proudly moving the opposite direction. And they're pulling Western universities with them. When China wants to have secret agreements, well, they push that on Western universities, which sign secret agreements. When China wants misbehavior of one kind or another, and we'll get into all the sorts of shenanigans that have been going on, Western universities increasingly accede to that. Western universities are lowering themselves to China's standards instead of attempting to raise China up to Western standards. And when that happens, it's time to cut the cord. If we're not pulling up the rope, but if they're pulling us down by the rope, we have to cut that rope before we get drowned along with them.
Anand, just coming to you, since you spent over 10 years reporting from China, tell us a little bit about the Hanban, which has its roots in, I think, at least 162 countries. It controls what I call those Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms. What is that relationship, and how does that sit with the overall CCP strategy? Because it's looked at as a benign institution teaching language and cultural teaching and exchange, but is it really that?
Well, Amitabh, actually, even though the attention has been on the Confucius Institute in the last couple of years, they've actually been around for a long time. And I think the first was established in 2004 in Seoul. That's right. So I think that they've been around for a while. And in the words of Hanban, they are merely trying to replicate what institutions we are familiar with, such as Alliance Francaise, the Goethe Institute, British Council are doing. But the broader problem, Amitabh, is that, as you know, the political structure of China is different from these other countries. And I think they make no bones about the fact that ultimately the goal of such initiatives, including Hanban, is to strengthen the image of the Communist Party of China overseas. And I think that is a broader sort of objective of having these Confucius Institutes. But at the same time, Amitabh, they are teaching things like calligraphy and language, at least the ones that I know I'm familiar with in India. They are teaching calligraphy, language, things like that. And one reason, Amitabh, is I think India has somewhat been ahead of the curve in limiting what these institutes and classrooms can and cannot do in a way that I think many Western universities have not, where they've been accepting a lot of funding that often comes with strings attached.
Professor Bhavan is just talking about those strings attached. You are saying that Western universities, many of them, not all of them, are compromised. But action is being taken now. Is this action only reflecting the current mood vis-a-vis China? But whether you look at the US, I think it was University of Maryland, the first one, CI, which is closed in Europe, Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium. The US has designated the coordinating organization a foreign mission. In Australia itself, there is a federal law that is proposed, right?
Well, there is now a lot of pushback against the Confucius Institutes, but I think that's motivated by how universities have behaved with regard to them. It's not so much motivated by this idea that Confucius Institutes are spreading Chinese propaganda. I even think that narrative is really overblown. Of course, they use Chinese textbooks, but they use standard textbooks. They don't especially push a Chinese political message. The corrosive effect of Confucius Institutes is when they change university behavior, when the universities self-censor, when universities change their own governance standards, lower their own governance standards to meet those of the Confucius Institutes. Now, that has raised a big hue and cry in the United States. In the United States 2 years ago, there were more than 100 university-based Confucius Institutes. We're now down, as of last count, last month, we're down to 65 Confucius Institutes in the United States at universities, another 10 that are independent or not university affiliated. So we're seeing a real drawdown in Confucius Institutes. Universities are simply not renewing the contracts, and they're not renewing them because of the pressure that, frankly, people like us, that the media, that academics, that commentators have been putting on universities. They don't want to cut these ties. These are highly lucrative, and I hope we can get into the funding model and how that works. They don't want to cut these ties, but they're being pressured to cut these ties. Now, in the United States, that pressure is coming mainly from bad publicity, from politicians threatening to take action if universities don't clean up their own act. In Australia, as you mentioned, there is now a foreign relations bill which is about to be put before Parliament, which would give the federal government in Australia the power to abrogate those Confucius Institute contracts. We don't know if they will or not, but it would give the federal government the power to do so, and we'll see what comes of that.
Will it also give the federal government in Australia the power to cut off provincial agreements, like, say, the Victorian Premier has initialed with China? Anand, you were talking about India being ahead of the curve, but is the mood such, especially in India post-Galwan, that there's so much scrutiny on, say, the CIs? There is a review, I think, a letter written on the 29th of July, and there's a review being carried out by the Ministry of Education, at least, and I think the MEA, the External Affairs Ministry, had also issued a statement, right? What's the status?
That's right. So the review is ongoing, and we first heard about it in July. And as far as I'm aware, the Han ban lists only 6 sort of initiatives that are ongoing with India. These are 3 full-fledged Confucius Institutes and 3 smaller Confucius classrooms, as they call it. But what's interesting is India is kind of distinguished between the Confucius Institute program and other areas of working with Han ban. For instance, in 2012, there was a major project to train 300 teachers, Mandarin teachers, so they'd come and teach in Indian schools. And so the Indian government said, listen, we're fine with working with our interest to learn Mandarin, but we have very clear limits on what foreign institutions can do on Indian soil. For instance, even American universities can't just come here and open up campuses and things like that. So they said, listen, Chinese institutes can't just come in and have their own autonomous bodies on Indian campuses. So that kind of limited what they could do from the start. But what's interesting, Amitabh, is I think this review seems to be going beyond Confucius Institutes in India to other forms of cooperation that institutions are having, especially in science and technology. And all MOUs, as I understand, between Indian universities and Chinese universities are now being reviewed. What comes out of the review process, we have to wait and see. But I think, Amitabh, there's no going back from the fact that I think the message from India, the broader message is, whether it's economic ties, whether it's educational ties, I think there's a major rethink going on after the events this summer on the border, and that there is going to be a greater sense of scrutiny and caution. But I don't think they're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think where it's in our interest to learn Mandarin and work with them, we'll continue, but keeping a close eye on them.
To jump in, I think that issue that unauthorized of
Go
the
ahead.
legality of some of these contracts is really very relevant. For example, the Confucius Institutes and the Confucius classrooms, which are in K through 12 schools, China provides the teachers who come in on special visas to teach, at least in Australia and the United States, that's the way it works. Well, are they being hired in accordance with local employment laws? We seriously doubt that. I mean, for instance, in Australia, and in the United States, it's illegal to discriminate on the basis, for example, of religion or on the basis of sexuality. Well, we have no idea what kind of criteria China is applying in its hiring of these teachers who are being sent on these special visas. Now, we can't even scrutinize that because, at least in Australia and the United States, the contracts that Confucius Institutes have with universities are secret. They're almost all confidential. Some US universities have voluntarily published the contracts they have with the Hanban. But in general, we don't even know the terms. So we don't know whether or not the law is being broken. And we don't know, because everything is so confidential, that we have no way to scrutinize it.
It seems to be, of course, the Chinese symbol, which is non-scrutable. Just going to take some comments here. Rajiv Narayanan says the Confucius Institute is part of China's three warfare strategy. Also, Hanban, he misspells that, reports to the United People's Works Department, which is the propaganda arm of the CPC. We've talked about that. Just going back to the last point you were making, Anant, about not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Now, India is extremely conscious also of the fact that it needs the strategic insight and understanding with China. And for that, it's not overnight. You need to develop these arms of understanding, of language, of culture, and the Ministry of External Affairs has its own study group, etc. But
right.
That is also important. You can't really, have this blanket ban because of the mood, because that's going to hurt you strategically in the long term as well, because ultimately you need to understand them if they're your adversary, right?
That is one concern I have, Amitabh, is that you may veer to the other extreme. And I think that Salvatore was right in the sense that sometimes we tend to overblow what their capabilities are. You think that somebody who's coming to teach a class in a university in Tamil Nadu is some kind of agent or whatever. I mean, sometimes we tend to go overboard. Of course, there is reason to scrutinize. But my concern is if you go to the other extreme, for instance, some people raise a lot of questions that the new education policy in India left out Mandarin in examples of foreign languages that would be taught in Indian schools. I think it even mentioned, no disrespect to Thailand, but it did mention Thai, but not mentioning Mandarin is to me a bit perplexing. Whether or not you're going to have good relations with China or bad relations with China, you need to invest intellectual resources in understanding the place. And so I think that we have to look at India's interest. And here, Amitabh, I would draw a little bit of a difference between what's happening in India and the broader debate about Chinese influence operations in Australia, in the US. I think they're slightly different, and I think we should be sensitive to our own immediate context. For example, just a fact that in a lot of these countries, you have a sizable overseas Chinese diaspora that is playing a major role in this effort. In India, we don't have that. In India, the Chinese population is minimal. So I think with policies and how we are going to go about it, my only point would be we should be very sensitive to our own self-interest and not be entirely swayed by what's happening in other countries as we devise our own policies.
Dr. Bhavan, what's happening in other countries now? You mentioned for decades now, it's not just the funding of universities and their programs, the teachers, buildings, infrastructure, etc. You earlier were talking about how to get over that funding issue. What are the solutions, say, in the West, where that problem is contextual, as Anand is pointing out, may not be so relevant to India?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that Chinese influence operations are not primarily directed at public opinion or at propaganda. They're primarily directed at influencing elites by trying to get, whether it's universities or business corporations or politicians, taking a Chinese point of view. And that's, of course, what's so dangerous, because so much of that kind of operation happens behind closed doors. Now, we've seen lots of that in Australia. For example, the two Australian universities, UTS and RMIT, I believe it is, have a $10 million cooperation with a Chinese firm that's developing facial recognition tools to be used in Xinjiang to repress the Uyghur population in Western China. Now, that's scary. We don't want that sort of thing happening, but we've allowed those sorts of contracts to corrupt us into participating in a Chinese police state, and not only participating in it, but then not wanting to call it out, right? Because if you condemn that, you're risking a $10 million contract. And it's these sort of terms. Now, if these contracts were all open, then we would see far fewer of them. I mean, no university wants to admit to engaging in that kind of research. They'd much rather it be kept secret. And there is a culture of secrecy around this that I think is ultimately what's threatening to our democracies. I mean, if everything's out in the open, I have full confidence in the Western democracies and Indian democracy to handle themselves. The problem is when we allow elites to keep these things in the dark, to keep their own China connections in the dark so that the rest of us are unable to question them because we just don't know what's happening.
Anand's pointing out it may not be so contextual to India, but one solution from a viewer asked Dagbert to not throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of learning at least Mandarin is instead we should invite Taiwan Chinese tutors to teach Mandarin. Anyway, just Anand, the larger issue which has been coming up, and I've been looking at it, and there have been warnings for decades now of, which have not been heeded. There's a new book out by Clive Hamilton also called Hidden Hand, of how the CCP is trying to reshape the world, and the secret services are spending years cultivating relationships in Western universities, think tanks to infiltrate there, and there's intellectual property defense programs which are being stolen. On that front, what's your experience, Anand?
No, I think that India is hasn't been at the top of their radar in terms of how much they're investing in doing these things in Europe and America. One thing I did write about a few years ago was the fact that they were doing things with the Indian media through these fellowships that I reported on, where journalists from South Asia, Africa would come and spend a year in Beijing, completely sort of sponsored, and would write stories. And the problem I had with that was Indian newspapers weren't disclosing the terms in which the reporters were being based. So I think that was one example of something that caught my attention because it was new. Even though I did add that a lot of countries do this, but what is different, I think, as Salvatore said, here sometimes there doesn't seem to be that much openness in what these initiatives are, how people are selected, what the terms and conditions are. So I would say that initiatives in India on the scale of what you see in the West is nowhere there in comparison. But the other thing for India, which I think we've been slow to react, which has only happened because of the boundary issue, is one example is their ties with Indian companies, especially in the tech space, in the startup space, in terms of China emerging as a big investor in many Indian companies, including media companies in the digital space that aren't covered by the limits that traditional media are covered by. And I think people have not paid any attention to that in India so far. And I think the debate is just getting started in India right now because of the events on the boundary, which I thought was a little bit of an irony, because people have been reporting about this for years from the point of view of influence, of personal information, of privacy. That didn't really stir much attention in India, but the events on the boundary did.
I mean, building on what Anath was saying, in Eastern Europe, we've seen the same sort of operations with think tanks, where China has been funding think tanks all across Eastern Europe, where think tanks are thinly funded, and even a $10,000 grant, small amounts of money by American or Australian standards, can buy the devotion of an entire think tank that may be one of the leading think tanks in its country. And they've been flying Eastern European think tank leaders under the originally it was a 16+1 initiative between China and the Eastern European countries. They've been flying them to conferences in China. It's something that's very attractive to Eastern Europeans who are, often don't have the opportunity for this sort of international travel. And they go back, and of course, these are European Union member countries, many of them, that are exerting influence within the European Union, bought on the cheap by China.
Again, when you're talking about think tanks, CIIS, I think China Institute for International and Strategic Studies, which is seen as the arm of the military intelligence. A lot of work out there saying that, there are spotters for foreign spies, agents of influence, and horror stories, or what we see only in movies, with money, blackmail, honey traps involved in both these think tanks and universities to get information and even technology transfer through expertise.
I think that's been happening God knows how long in the US, and I found it's interesting how everything seems to be coming out in the open in the last couple of years or so. But I think, frankly, it was an open secret in terms of things going on with researchers, for example, with military backgrounds, going and doing postgraduate programs in the US and taking things back with them. I think it was, frankly, an open secret for many years. In India, I think, Amitabh, the concern I have is I think that our think tanks are fairly new. Our think tank scene is fairly new. They aren't very well entrenched. And I think right now they're subject to influence not just from China, but from everywhere, from the US as well. So I think for India, our concern is, as we develop our own independent network of think tanks, how do we do that in a way that we are ensuring they are speaking for Indian interests and not being swayed by others? And I would underline that I don't think it's a China-specific problem, though, of course, China does come with its own unique set of challenges by being a one-party state. But it's something that I think we should be keeping our eyes open. Frankly, if any country is trying to influence the outputs of a think tank in India, we should be concerned.
Well, and they should be declaring it. I mean, we've had the spectacle.
Yeah, what should
we've had the spectacle in the United States
be keeping its eyes open for?
So we've had the spectacle in the United States of a Harvard professor being dragged off to federal court and facing federal charges, Charles Lieber at Harvard, for not declaring income or grant income from Chinese institutions. Now, it's not that difficult to require a foreign registry. Australia just set one up last year. The United States has had one for a while, to require agents of foreign influence to declare that they're receiving money from foreign governments, from foreign organizations. It's an obvious thing to require. I don't know if India requires it. If India doesn't, it should. And that puts it all out in the open. And any think tank that's accepting Chinese funding openly will then have to wear that when it writes reports on China.
Do we have any regulations like that, Anand? And also, if, say, CIs are targeted or Hanban is targeted, they can just change their name, right? I think there's a process that's already on, or they already have changed their name.
You're right. There was a report in the South China Morning Post saying that because of this stream of bad publicity, they're thinking of changing the name, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem, because of the context of this new global debate about dealing with China and its political system isn't going to go away. I think that I would just really want to underline what Salvatore said. It's all about disclosure, disclosure, disclosure. Whether you're a think tank, whether you're a media house, be open about what you're doing. Whether it's in terms of advertorials is one thing, Amitabh, that in our profession has become an issue. Where you get these paid up supplements that often don't really let the reader know very clearly what they are. I think whether it's media, whether it's think tanks, whether it's universities, I think the most important thing is to disclose where your funding is coming from and be open about it. I think just doing that will address a lot of the questions that people have in their minds.
Dr. Bopan, do you agree?
Well, very much so. For example, Anand mentioned paid supplements. I'm a columnist for Foreign Policy Magazine. That's where my article appeared that we've been talking about. It's time for Western universities to drop China. Foreign Policy Magazine publishes an insert from the China Daily. Many American newspapers do. The New York Times does. The Washington Post does. It's very common, but it's clearly marked as advertising material. And at least at foreign policy, it certainly doesn't affect editorial policy. Foreign policy is one of the most aggressively anti-China, China hawk publications in the United States, yet they carry the advertising anyway. It's clearly marked, it's publicly available, and people know how to treat it. Look, I think most people are not easily duped. Most people, when they see official propaganda, they know it's official propaganda, and they don't take it too seriously. When they see something like Strut News Global, which is a very independent-minded organization, they know it's independent-minded and they can trust it. And the key thing is just that it be clear who's speaking and who you're speaking for.
Both of you, Dr. Babones and Anand Krishnan, have been very clear on your speaking on this show. I thank you again for your time and your insights.
Thanks.
You've been watching Strat News Global and Talking Point, our weekly show. And if you like shows like this, videos like this, do subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the bell icon. And you can also support our kind of journalism on our website, Strat News Global. I'm Amit Abri.